Hello. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for a conversation on notable Nantucket women. My name is Amelia Holmes, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's panelists. Moderating tonight is Dr. Valerie Paley. She is Vice President and Director of the Center for Women's Studies, Center for Women's History, and Chief Historian at the New York Historical Society. Michael R. Harrison is the Nantucket Historical Association's Obed Macy Research Chair. Dr. Jeffrey Kovac is a professor at Charter Oak State College in New Britain, Connecticut, and was the 2016 Burney Research Fellow at the Nantucket Historical Association. Jamie Steem is a Washington journalist and public speaker whose op-eds and essays on politics and culture have been widely published, including in the Washington Post, Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Chicago Tribune. And finally, we have Betsy Tyler joining us tonight. She is a Nantucket Historical Association Research Fellow and served as the inaugural Obed Macy Research Chair. Thank you. So I hand it over to you now, Valerie.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Amelia. And thank you to our panelists as well. I might add to our audience, as the conversation ensues, please feel free to start thinking about questions because we will have some time at the end of the program for Q&A. So, historians and practitioners of women's history had long anticipated this year, 2020, monumental year, commemorating the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment. This is the suffrage amendment, of course, passed in August 1920 and removing sex as a barrier to the vote and granting suffrage to most American women. This year, although so many other unexpected things have splintered our focus, we still have an opportunity to contemplate the fact that before 1920, over half the US population did not have this fundamental right. So typically, the creation story of women's suffrage casts an 1848 meeting in Seneca Falls, New York, as the starting point. There, the two-day Women's Rights Convention adopted a controversial declaration of sentiments modeled on the language of the Declaration of Independence, listing a set of grievances about the subservient status of American women and asserting that all men and women are created equal. This was huge. It set in motion other women's rights conventions and put the idea of women's suffrage on the table and in public consciousness for the first time in American history. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is usually remembered as the star of the Seneca Falls Convention. But in fact, it was local Quaker women who organized the meeting. And this is where Nantucket comes in. The idea of the convention was precipitated by a visit to Seneca Falls from Nantucket-born Lucia Coffinmott, the abolitionist, activist, and social reformer who was a famed orator. So tell us a bit about Lucretia Mott.
Should I start?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Valerie. Lucretia Coffinmott was the main draw at Seneca Falls. She was already famous, both here on stateside and internationally in London. She was the greatest woman in antebellum America. And that is the best kept secret, not only on Nantucket, but among historians. And she grew up on the island, and the island shaped and formed her character like clay and made her very self-reliant, gave her a sense of her own agency, and also made her very precocious when it came to a social conscience. As you may know, Quakers were the first religion to officially oppose and resist slavery. In a seafaring community, she knew what the Middle Passage was really like. So she made it her lifelong mission to overthrow slavery, and she did it with her voice. She wasn't elected to anything, right? She was the United States. She was a leader, more than a reformer, more than an activist. She was a champion of human rights, and she made her voice sound all over the nation.
Jeffrey, Michael, anything to add about Lucretia Mott?
I'd be happy to add that when Lucretia was exchanging a series of letters with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she noted in these correspondences that specifically Nantucket were raised with this sense of activism within them. And this is in early 19th century, but it goes back to the 18th century. It goes back to an island where the men were often away for considerable periods of time whaling, and women served not only in running the family business, but also running Quaker meetings in very public ways that you could not find in either other denominations or in other geographic areas. And that was the world in which Lucretia Mott raised, and she saw that in her first years. So she's growing up with that, and it even influenced her younger sister, Martha Coffinmott, who didn't spend that time on Nantucket growing up, but just from being around Lucretia, that kind of carried over to her upbringing, to her activism, which would be equally instrumental in terms of women's rights and in terms of abolition.
Yeah. It predisposed these girls and women to be very independent and very self-reliant and capable, not only of taking care of their families, as you say, but almost running the island. Nantucket was all but a matriarchy because the men and boys were away for years at sea, whaling. And once her father was feared lost at sea, actually, for 3 years. And when he came home, walking up from the wharf, she said that was the happiest day of her life.
Oh, Michael, no, to add something, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit with the context because, you know, the Quaker emphasis on equality between the sexes and education for all people and sort of personal enlightenment, for lack of a better phrase at the moment, you know, really does set the stage for the context out of which Lucretia Mott's activism springs. But a couple of comments here about, you know, this being a seafaring community aware of what the horrors of the Middle Passage might have entailed for people. The island is often thought of as being this remote, isolated place. And it's celebrated now as a tourist destination because it's getting away from it all. But increasingly, research on Nantucket trading shows the degree to which the island is far out at sea, but it is not cut off. It is right on the shipping lanes, going here, there, and everywhere. It has regular communication by vessel, by sea, to all the major population centers of the US East Coast, to France and England. And these people are able to communicate and correspond with people elsewhere. So their ideas don't just have, their ideas are not uninformed, are not unworldly, and their ideas are able to get out to other places. Lucretia Mott, when she's no longer living on the island, is able to talk with her family and communicate with her family easily because this as a whaling port has these communication things. So I think that's also an important sort of context for the island's position within this national conversation.
Mm-hmm. And when you say the Quaker influence, I mean, that was bedrock for her. She was educated in a friend's school, which educated boys and girls. It was co-ed. It was right across the street from her house. So all her life, she took her faith with her wherever she went. And in her speaking, her very inspired speaking, she always went beyond the walls of her faith, but kept the Quaker manner of speaking without notes, inspired as the Spirit moved her in the moment. And she had, her voice really lifted people up. And Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, leaves the best living portrait of how he would never forget the first time that he heard Massachusetts, because her voice apparently was like a musical instrument that rose and fell like summer rain. And we don't know how great she was because it's been lost in translation. There are no recordings of her voice. That was her power. And Frederick Douglass is our best witness to that.
Well, you can't have a better witness than Frederick Douglass. Quaker, we keep coming back to to Quakerism, and Quaker women profoundly influenced the abolitionist and women's rights movements. Jeff, you've written a lot on this topic. Tell us how and why.
I think that the how and why comes down to, for Quakerism in general, the Society of Friends formed in the middle of the 17th century with very strong female leadership from the start. As George Fox is presenting his ideas and gaining a following, Margaret Fellow's right there with him. And she is really among the first Quaker matriarch. And that's a word I use sometimes, and it's one that I heard Jamie use as well, in that I think Nantucket also had a bit of a Quaker matriarchy, and this goes back to the roots. The founding of the meeting in 1708, it was when traveling ministers arrived and were trying to spread the inner light, as Friends, as Quakers refer to it, to the settlers on Nantucket. It was when Mary Coffin Starbuck first was converted. Her conversion was essentially when those traveling ministers recognized that this island would become a haven for Quakerism. And that extended throughout the 18th century, from 1708 and the founding of the monthly meeting through the entirety of the 18th century. Women were running the Quaker meeting, and in large degrees were running the island in the absence of a majority of the men. So this is all tied together in terms of the abolitionism and the women's rights component of it. I think the women's rights aspect of Quakerism was there from the founding. It was there from the founding, and certainly is embedded strongly on Nantucket. The abolitionism comes from a variety of theological aspects of the Society of Friends, notions of equality under God, and so forth. And we see that into the late 18th, early 19th century on the island, when a woman like Anna Gardner experiences from a very young age seeing her family help hide a runaway enslaved person who was a part of the Underground Railroad. That left such an imprint that Nantucket became a center, even though it was geographically relatively isolated from the mainland. It became a center for anti-slavery movements, conventions that were held here, the Brotherhood of Thieves event. All of that ties into the island, and from its very start, the Quakerism combined with the activism that it promoted throughout the 18th century.
Mm-hmm.
So these Quaker sensibilities are obviously so much a part of the DNA of the island. Strong, independent women were essential to the island's function. Tell us, Betsy, what were Nantucket women's lives like in the 18th and 19th centuries on the island?
I'm sorry, my internet is unstable, and I'm not sure what that question was, but I think it might have been directed to me.
Yes, tell us a bit about women's lives in the 18th and 19th centuries on the island.
Well, that's obviously a very broad question, but there's some generalizations that can be made that have already been spoken to by other participants. But the mere fact that it's a maritime community, isolated from the mainland, is a real factor for the women who lived here. They were more self-sufficient perhaps because of that, because the men of the family, the husbands, the fathers, were away from home for periods from months to years at a time. So women had to step up, and they had more responsibilities, and they also had more freedom. So it was sort of a double-edged sword, you know, to be the person left at home. But they didn't by any means run political power. You know, they couldn't vote and they couldn't hold public office. So their influence was very personal, and it was very, they were supportive of each other. They were influential in the domestic sphere. And they were educated, as Jeffrey's spoken about. The Quaker belief in the education of girls is so important. They were educated people. They had voices, you know, they had the ability to speak and stand on their own feet. And then they also, even though most of their experience was secondhand, they were aware of the wider world because of where all the Nantucket ships had gone. And, you know, the men in their families had been perhaps to Europe or South America, or into the Pacific, or even to China. So they had all these elements combined to make them, I think, different from women in other small communities, perhaps inland somewhere. I mean, these women, they had sort of a leg up on a worldview. And I think that influenced a lot of them.
So, 2
years. Pardon me?
No worries, don't worry. You're still unstable, but we heard you loud and clear.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I am unstable.
No. No, I know you've read a lot of the, a lot. Go on, sorry.
Okay. You know, by the mid-19th century, someone like Susan Beater, born in 1816, she's from a family of mariners. She's heard these stories about other parts of the world. She's educated. She's actually been trained somehow in ship portraiture. She's an artist. She has the opportunity to go with her husband on a whaling voyage, and off she goes for 4 years, which is a remarkable thing for any man or woman to do. And I see my connection's unstable again, but it gave rise to women who did extraordinary things, I think. And not all of them are well known, but still remarkable.
That's so actually my own line of thinking these days has been about the women who have done extraordinary things, but those whose names we'll never necessarily know, who come together and affect a time and a place just by coming together, marching, signing petitions, etc. And 2 years before the Seneca Falls Convention in 1846, Nantucket suffered a catastrophic fire that would ultimately change the built environment of the town in the decades to come. And the island's women were essential to this rebuilding. Michael, tell us how so.
Yeah, so the fire is a really interesting event in island history. In hindsight, the fire has become this great symbol of the end of the whaling industry on the island and a period of decline that was only ended by redeveloping the island's economy into a tourist economy. At the time, the fire was certainly traumatic. It destroyed the central business district, destroyed homes. Recovery from it was actually quite fast. They rebuilt things within months, and the industries that were here, kept going. But within about 10 years, 10, 12, 15 years, whaling on Nantucket had collapsed through other forces beyond the fire. And there is this idea on Nantucket that, when whaling was in its heyday, so many men were away that the women ran, fill in the blank. They ran everything, they ran all the businesses. And as Betsy has said just a moment ago, women were positively vital to the economic success of the island through its entire history. But during whaling, their influence was largely within meeting, within the home, possibly helping out with family businesses, but there's more than enough men on island to run the shops and stores of the island during whaling. After the fire, after the collapse of whaling, people start leaving the island. They take their families away, and the demographics change. The island becomes majority women, 54%. The demographics skew older. There are a lot more people on the island over 70. And so it's much more vital in the 1860s and 70s and 80s for women to be in the workforce and running shops. And what is created is what's become known as Petticoat Row, which was a center street, particularly centered in a building built after the fire. Fire destroyed Commercial Center Street, and a new unified building of shops was built in one block on one side of the street. And beginning in the 1850s, those shops were operated almost entirely by women, or women working with their husbands. And that remained the case up into the 1920s, even into the 1930s. Really strong district of women running businesses. And there are also women-run businesses elsewhere on island. The idea of the Petticoat Row, is sort of, because there were so many in one place. But the collapse of whaling and the change in demographics really means that women were put into roles, or were able to take on roles that they might not have had during the whaling period. And a lot of that is economic. I mean, there's the Riddell family, Charlotte Riddell, her husband is a whaling captain. He retires. He sets up an auction house on Main Street in 1857. And she opens a business on Center Street. And it's their combined incomes that help their family to stay on the island. Not his alone or hers alone, but theirs. And her daughters work in her shop with her. When she's too old to work, her one daughter, Mary, takes over the business. She herself marries a mariner, Captain Nye, and she then is famous for decades running a shop on Center Street, and then her daughter runs it as well. So it's things like that that develop, and there's this very visible presence of women in the public sphere for the people who are now visiting the island as a tourist destination. So it's not that women become more important, their visibility changes a bit after whaling, after the symbology of this fire. And the appearance of their influence to people who see it from the outside is somewhat different.
So this gives women a kind of a civic influence, but does it also give the Nantucket women some kind of political influence as well, prior to the vote?
There are actually women serving in political positions before the vote on Nantucket. Women are allowed to run for the school committee in the 1870s. And two women, in fact, are voted on. They, in fact, cannot vote in their own candidacy, for their own candidacy. But as early as the 1870s, women, and that is all coming out of these threads that we're talking about of yes, women should have these kind of positions and have this kind of voice and know these things best. And the island becomes a sort of early place in Massachusetts in which women are able to hold political office.
So it's safe to say that women were essential to the island economy in a larger sense, but we have alluded to this throughout the last half hour. No discussion of Nantucket could be complete without a very deep dive into the history and culture of whaling. So I think we've already touched on this, but have you anything to add about how the whaling industry impacted the island's women?
Well, islanders are almost by nature, ruggedly independent. So if you add whaling onto that, when men and boys are away for indefinite periods and children were in charge of keeping a lookout at the lighthouse when the ships would come in. So women and children really were, in charge, informally, maybe not elected to be in charge, but Lucia Mott writes about women going into Boston to get supplies like candles. That was a long way and back again. And they did have little small businesses, and I believe it was called Petticoat Row, even in that time. And they'd have to tend to not only their families, but to animals, sick animals. They might have to deliver babies and be midwives. And Lucia Coffinmott might run over to her Folger relatives on the other side of the island. So I think children, girls and boys, really had to cover the island on their own 2 feet, and they witnessed women being really capable to make the island, go round. And then when the men and boys arrived back, the ships would be smelling of sperm oil, and that was a huge event and a reunion for the island's families.
I think I would also throw in that, like other seafaring communities, the women are as aware of what the dangers and opportunities of the water are as the men are. And there is this culture of seafaring that everyone participates in, these expressions, of this, the whole language that people use on the island is influenced by seagoing terms. And it really is about this awareness that their livelihood is pinned to water activities, and that the women, although most of them stay at home during this, although there are quite a number of women who do go with their husbands on whaling voyages from Nantucket, they are all in this community together. And the maritime activity on Nantucket does go beyond whaling. There is trading, there is fishing, and like other regional communities, it's not just the men hauling in fish who are part of the economic equation. It's people back at home doing work. I think of the modern example of scalloping on Nantucket, where there are people out in the boat gathering the scallops, but then the shuckers are at home, or not at home, but they're back on land. And those are women, very often women, men and women together, children with the parents, all doing that activity in order to make that work. And so I think
this cycle that they're all interdependent. All her life, she lived in Philadelphia, the Quaker city, the rest of her life, and she always used nautical expressions from Nantucket, to describe the city weather. And she cooked, she made her mother's dishes from the island, blackberry pudding. She was an island girl at heart. And incidentally, you were talking about the abolitionist movement. There was an 1848 abolitionist convention on Nantucket, which is where Frederick Douglass first spoke and told everyone his lived experience as a slave. And he electrified the gathering. He's informally invited to stand and speak by William Coffin, who would have been related to Lucretia Coffin. So that's a very nice symbiosis between the two. And Nantucket was very much a hotbed of abolition, along with New Bedford, which is right across the water. And in 1848, Frederick Douglass was at Seneca Falls, as you probably know.
Busy year for him. It was a busy year for him.
Yeah, it was.
He was a very busy public intellectual. But yes, indeed, he did play the starring role to put the idea of suffrage on the table, which was not necessarily the focus of the Seneca Falls Convention until then.
He persuaded the convention that it wouldn't be worth anything, this piece of paper, if they didn't include suffrage among the demands. Lucretia Mott had to be convinced, and she was, but we have to just credit Frederick Douglass that he was a women's rights man right from the beginning, present at the creation.
Another Nantucket related man who was at Seneca Falls who signed the Declaration of Sentiments was Edward Fitch Underhill. He was only 19 then, but in the 1870s, he came to Nantucket and just fell in love with the Sconset and wrote the first history of Sconset, developed a community there. And he was he was an interesting person, but he has that Nantucket connection as well.
That's good to know. That I'm not surprised, but that's good to know. There were a lot of men at Seneca Falls. They sent out the invitation in the newspapers, and 400, maybe between 400 and 500 people showed up in this little town. Has anyone been to Seneca Falls? I have not. near the lake region, pretty little town. And the fact that Lucretia Mott was going to speak was the reason why people came. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she mentored Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony wasn't there, but obviously she and Cady Stanton were lifelong friends and allies, partners. But Lucretia Mott was a generation older than them, and she was the famous one. I have to tell you that because she was very modest. She wouldn't tell you that.
Well, it's good that she has you as biographer. Michael, you want to add something to that?
Oh, I was just, yeah, I was just going to make some joke about us being her mouthpiece now. But one of the things that, again, with this whaling, whaling connection that, is worth mentioning, whale ships tended to be owned in shares. The risk of a voyage, while there was insurance, the risk of voyage was spread out among various owners. And women would own shares in whaling ships.
Oh.
It also reminds me, I'm currently studying a 1790 voyage, trading voyage from Nantucket to France. And all of these different merchants are putting cargo on this vessel. And the captain is writing down, Mr. Coffin has given me his casks of oil, what should I do with them? And one of the notations is that we are to sell this as Mrs. Hussey directs. And so there is even this, Mrs. Hussey is the one making the decision about how they're going to dispose of this in France. And another one from the same voyage is, and I'm forgetting the surnames of these people, but a mother comes with her son to the captain saying, I want to sign my 13-year-old son up as a crewman on your voyage. And she is the one making that transaction. Even the husband is still in the picture. I mean, he's not gone, but she's the one doing that. And so that, again, everyone in the community is aware of the importance and the ins and outs of these activities, and have a hand in it in one way or another. And how that changes over time, what that exactly is. But I think the importance of women within the economic community of Nantucket, that remains constant throughout.
And whaling was very lucrative. This is a prosperous community. The island was flourishing until it wasn't anymore. But Lucretia Mott was born in 1793, and that was still the heyday. And it was the capital of the whaling industry. So it was a very unusual life, but they were well off.
It was a comfortable community. For communities of this size, yes.
Mm-hmm.
As you say, until it wasn't. Except that now it's extremely prosperous. Just it has a different thing. It tells the history of whaling. Instead of killing whales, we sell the history of killing whales.
I mean, it certainly was lucrative, but it obviously came with its risks. And that's one way in which the Quaker meeting stepped up. And when we're talking about a Quaker meeting, we're not just speaking of religious services. The meeting functioned as a monthly business meeting. That there were parallel men's and women's meetings going on every month, and the women's meeting would handle various activities that were kind of specific to a whaling community like that, such as raising money for women who were widowed from the whaling voyages or what have you, offering the levels of support to their fellow female friends on the island. Friends meeting from the Society of Friends Quakers. And that was the way in which the meeting was kind of functioning together collectively for the support of women. And that's from a very early period. That's from fairly early in the 18th century. And it did carry over.
To sustain the community.
Indeed. We are to our question and answer portion of the evening, and we are getting a flurry of questions right now. We're delighted to answer them. And our first is, when might women have become property owners on Nantucket? Was that a factor in allowing a person to have a role in island politics? Any of our panelists know the answer to that question?
Well, I think the women who did become property owners were either single women or widowed. Women did inherit property from their fathers. And I've looked at many probate records and estate inventories where women got, could get a pretty equal share, sisters with their brothers. It was not like the English first son gets everything model. So women did, they did own property, and they, as early as, I think it was in the 1850s, there was a woman who was able to purchase a house in Sconset, and in the deed it says, without the interference or benefit of her husband in the deed. So there is evidence of that.
And did that give them a role in island politics or not?
I don't think so, not in politics. No.
Not a direct role.
Mm-mm.
Not a, yeah.
But although it's interesting, before the vote, you see women have different ways of having a political empowerment or agency without the vote. And they find these inroads, just not just in Nantucket, but in general in the early 19th century. Next question, were there different factions of Quakers on the island early on?
No. No.
Just the one, just no different factions. Jeff,
There
Jeff,
were
this is
later. I'm sure Jeffrey can speak to that.
Well, there were schisms that were taking place up and down the coast at different times, from your Hicksite schisms to your
But the Hicksite schism wasn't until 1827.
Right, and it didn't really necessarily impact Nantucket in the way that it impacted other places. You don't get, and I think part of it is that the meeting was, because the meeting was from its onset, a part of the larger New England yearly meeting, but it was geographically separate from the other monthly meetings that were a part of the New England yearly meeting. That kind of did set it apart to where there wasn't as much of that sort of outside influence that led to some of the schisms within other monthly meetings.
Right.
Next question, this one's for Betsy. Was Susan Veeder a typical whaling wife? Was there a typical whaling wife?
Well, I'm not sure there was, but she would typically have given up whatever responsibilities and freedoms she might have had on shore when her husband was away to go whaling when he is the captain of the ship, and his word is law. So on one hand, she's giving up some of her independence and freedom, but then on the other hand, she's getting to experience something that few women of her age, of her milieu, experience. So I don't think there's a typical woman. I think it's hard to know the motives of these women who went whaling with their husbands. In the journals that they kept, they don't really tell us why they went. I think some might have been encouraged by their husbands to go, perhaps even insisted that she go. But I think in Susan Veeder's case, she had a desire to make this voyage. But I'll never know for sure.
It's a brave woman who wants to take that voyage for sure. Here's a question about Maria Mitchell. What were her activities while she resided on Nantucket?
Well, she was she was well educated by her father, who was a teacher, and she came from a large kind of vivacious Quaker family, if that's possible. And then she became librarian of the Athenaeum and was librarian for 20 years. And that's where she got her education. It was, she was self-taught and taught by her father because she was an astronomer. She was a scientist. She got her basic knowledge and her education and her experience in the sciences on Nantucket before she discovered that comet and became nationally famous and went on to a career at Vassar.
Yes. I'm a Vassar graduate myself, so very proud of our Mariah Mitchell. And imagine finding that comet or seeing it on the roof, just like with her telescope on the roof of the bank building. It's quite extraordinary to just imagine that. Here's a question from Michael. Can you explain the link between the Great Fire and the end of the whaling industry? How did this lead to Petticoat Row?
So the link is more symbolic than direct. You know, the fire destroys the central business district. The townspeople rebuild it quite quickly and go about their activities. But Nantucket as a center, as an auspicious place to pursue whaling from was already, you know, for 10, 20 years, had already been changing. You know, when America has no railroads and everything is done by the water, Nantucket is a great place to go whaling from and to run a whaling empire, because you're just as competitive as New Bedford or Boston or Providence. But once you've got railroads and once you can have other industries and you can reach markets inland easier and by means other than just water, Nantucket doesn't have an advantage anymore. Why would you bring oil here and process it and ship it away? And that's all happening, is developing in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. The fire does damage, but it's rebuilt. But then by 1855, it's dead. It's just, you can't do this anymore. So the fire takes on a symbolic importance that arguably might be beyond what its actual damage was. And it is the end of whaling in general that helps create an economic environment where more women are needed to be in frontline economic roles in the community, running stores, running shops, and that's the origins of Petticoat Row. There are certainly women who run shops and stores on Nantucket prior to the fire. They tend to be running them because they're widowed and they have a family to support. The idea of something called Petticoat Row does not exist on Nantucket until after the Civil War. And literally the building in which most of the Petticoat Row businesses existed between 1865 and 1925 is literally built after the Great Fire. It is a big development because a site was empty because of the fire. So those are the connections. Again, it's somewhat more symbolic, but it's this economic change that really leads to this, you know, concentration of women-owned businesses that's known as Petticoat Row.
Well, here's another question about women in business, and that is, did women participate in the whaling industry, such as taking over a business when a spouse died?
I can't offhand think, I'm going to say there must have been women who owned businesses that continued after their husbands died. I can't think of a good example offhand, so I could be wrong, but so many other things on Nantucket, Betsy may know an example, but women certainly own shares in these vessels. They are supporting. I don't know of women who go whaling in a working capacity. There are plenty of women who go with their husbands, and then of course they contribute to the voyage in one way or another, but they're not throwing harpoons and rowing boats and doing things like that. Betsy, do you know of an example of a factory that was inherited by a woman?
You know, I don't. I was thinking of Betsy Carey, who ran an inn, but I think, you know, I'm not sure her husband ever ran that with her. You know, he was a mariner who died in the China trade. So, but
Yeah.
she was a successful businesswoman.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. She ran a hotel on Main Street after her husband died, and then later ran a shop and hostelry in Sconset.
Right.
But her economic situation was such, she was still working into her 80s. There's a write-up in Harper's in the 1860s of reporter, you know, somebody goes to visit Mother Carey at her shop in Sconset. And, you know, when you really think about it, it's slightly sad that she was 84, I think, I might be wrong about that, still has to be selling things out of her shop in Sconset to make a living at that point. But her hotel on Main Street was quite well known. We have the guest book from it in the collection at the museum.
Here's a question about Quakers. Was there more than one Quaker meeting on the island? And what does it mean, women's meeting?
Okay, since I mentioned the term women's meeting, I think I'll probably address this question. As far as there being one meeting on the island, for most of the period that we're talking about, there was one meeting on the island. Now there was decline at times later, but generally we're talking about one single meeting on Nantucket. You might think, well, some places might have multiple houses of worship of the same denomination. In this case, we're talking about one monthly meeting. Now, the way the structure worked was regionally there were yearly meetings that would be larger governing bodies. Nantucket belonged to the New England Yearly Meeting, which had been founded in Newport and had established a very large meeting house there. If you are ever in Newport, Rhode Island, and you see the Great Meeting House, it's an impressive building. Under the authority of the yearly meeting, each location would have a monthly meeting. That monthly meeting would include weekly worship that generally was segregated men and women, but in the same structure at the same time. And then there would be business meetings that both the men and the women held. So the men's monthly business meeting would be addressing their business, and then the women's monthly business meeting would be addressing theirs. The kind of business that they mostly addressed would be it would be clearing or approving women for marriage. A couple would appear before the business of both the men's and the women's meetings, declare their intent, and then the men's meeting would go off and investigate the potential groom, and the women's meeting would go off and investigate the potential bride, and then after a couple months of investigation and the couple returning, they would give their stamp of approval. So that was some of the function of the women's meeting. Now, if you look at it, this is a parallel structure where the women are acting in a very similar role to the men, and they're the ones running the women's meeting, running the women's business meetings. That is that's something that it happened only really within Quakerism at that time. It was the only denomination where that's happening. And because of that, combined with men being absent to the degree, the women's meeting wielded a considerable amount of power on the island. It was not in the context of holding political office necessarily, but it was this structure of relatively public, even though it was within one denomination. Most of the people on the island were friends up to a point. So it's a very public example of female authority going back to the 18th century. So that's why the women's meeting itself is important, because it is conducting this business.
We have another question about religion, and that is, were there any female preachers on Nantucket, and what became of them? Do we have any record of their sermons?
Well, there were preachers in other denominations. Phoebe Coffin-Hannaford is one who comes to mind because she was a very prominent person who, she left the island. She was a teacher here. I don't know that she began her preaching on the island, but she certainly came back to the island in later years and conducted services. But she's very well known. She's been written about a lot. And there were others. Yeah.
Interesting. Next question. Who was, and forgive me for mispronouncing her name, Keziah Coffin?
He was a Coffin relative.
Keziah Coffin. Betsy, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to try this one?
Oh, we can share. We can share. I could start just by, Keziah Coffin was a businesswoman. at the time of the American Revolution. She had a power of attorney from her husband, which allowed her to conduct business as a man would. And he was a mariner, but even when he was on shore, she continued to be in the role of the person conducting business in that family. She's been reviled in history as being involved in black market activities during the Revolutionary War and of being on the losing side. So, and there was a novel written in 1835 called Miriam Coffin, or the Whale Fisherman. And the Miriam Coffin of the title is Keziah, and it paints her as a, I don't even know how to describe it, but as a, kind of a wicked woman, when in fact I think she was just extremely capable and had the power, because she had a power of attorney, to do what other women didn't have the power to do. And I'll turn it over to Mike to say more.
That's it. I mean, her legend is quite large, particularly because of this fictionalized account of her life. But her husband, John, was a whaling captain and trading captain and would be away. And so she would run their business. And she was really good at it. And like many Nantucketers, they had, this is, before the Revolution, this is the center of British whaling. And so the main trading of whale oil and candles is through London. So they have all these connections to London. And she makes the most of that. And she very likely was involved in helping in smuggling during the Revolutionary War, whether that was, illicit against the American cause or just helping the island to survive. There's a lot of debate on that. Mm-hmm. And, charitably, we would think she's helping the island survive. But they were quite wealthy. They built a sort of showy home on Center Street. I can't remember, I think they're Quaker, but I can't remember exactly. But they had a very showy life in a way, is my understanding.
They were disowned.
Yeah. She was disowned for having a spinet in her home, a musical instrument.
That's right. Yes.
What's interesting is her husband was not disowned, even though it was in their home. She was the one who ended up essentially taking the blame from the meeting for having the spinet for her daughter. So it's kind of it's interesting that the blame was focused pretty squarely on her shoulders.
And she was cautioned against wearing too fashionable clothing. Also.
Sounds like a real character. We have another question about Lucretia Mott. Did she return to Nantucket and spend a significant amount of time on the island after her childhood?
Oh, yes, she did. She always looked. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Valerie, she always looked forward to going back to visit her relatives on Nantucket. And she, throughout her long life, she took trips to Nantucket maybe every 4 or 5 years, from Philadelphia, the Quaker city to the Quaker island. And she felt very connected there, even long after she left. The sand and the silver sea and the salt air, that was home in a way to her, that Philadelphia was too, but that was the adult Lucretia. This is the girl that, became this really strong and visionary personality on Nantucket. And if I could just add, she started out as an abolitionist. She founded the women's rights movement. And those two movements were the great human rights movements of the 19th century. And if you ask me which one was more important to her, they were one and the same. They were sister brother movements. They were grounded in the Quaker belief in universal equality and Enlightenment thinking as well. So that's an important note for the group.
Very important. Yeah. We unfortunately have come to our last question, and this is an interesting one. Would women take on lodgers in their own homes when the men were away, or if they became a widow, as opposed to running a bona fide inn?
Short answer is yes. They did. They advertised in the newspaper, you know, during the summer season. This is once we're in the 1870s and 80s. And Susan Beater, who I've written about, did just that when her husband disappeared. She put an ad in the local paper that she, you know, had rooms for boarders. So
Yeah.
that's not uncommon.
Yeah, absolutely. And we tend to think of businesses and homes being very distinct. And on Nantucket in like the 1820s, you know, somebody who runs a grocery, the grocery might be in part of their house or attached to their house. You know, we know many, many examples where an ocean store or a seamstress business or grocery is either it's in the basement, it's in the front parlor, it's in a building attached on the side. So when we see these ads for women running boarding houses, that's the house they live in. And how they keep their separate sphere different from the other probably wouldn't be the same way we might do it now. And there are many, many examples of women running, advertising, you know, taking in boarders and running a boarding house that we would not consider them to be running a hotel or an inn, and it's where they live.
Dolly Madison's mother ran a boarding house in Philadelphia, and she was a Quaker, as you may know, but she was disowned when she married a slave owner. Yeah, so the Quakers were there from the beginning of slave emancipation all the way through to 1863. They were there for the journey, and Lucretia Mott got to see one of her great movements come to fruition, but not the other.
So we're just about out of time, and I want to thank my panelists who were just extraordinarily knowledgeable and interesting, and wonderful conversation that speaks so highly of the uniqueness of this island and of the women who are part of it. So thank you so very much for being part of this fascinating panel. Sure, thank you.
Great. So thank you to you too, Valerie, and for everyone else joining us tonight. I'd particularly like to thank our members for their support, which make events like this one possible. If you are not yet a member of the Nantucket Historical Association, please consider joining us by visiting nha.org/membership. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.